Imagine your neighborhood is on fire, not one house, the whole block. Flames rolling up the walls, smoke choking the street, sirens in the distance that never get closer. Now imagine you're the only one outside with a bucket. A few people lean out their windows and shout, "Try the other side." Others offer to sell you water at a premium. Most just stare and wait to see if your roof caves in. That's the emotional reality Britain lived through in the early years of World War II. And if you've always pictured Weindershaus as a clean Allies versus Axis team-up from day one, this part of the story can feel uncomfortable. Because for a long stretch at the start, when the danger was most immediate, Britain was standing in the blast zone while much of the world hesitated, calculated, or focused on staying out. Before we get into it, quick note. If you like W.3 stories that cut through the clean textbook version and show the messy human reality, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Now, let's rewind to how this actually unfolded. Britain didn't start the war because bombs fell on London first. Britain declared war because it had promised to defend Poland if Germany attacked. And on September 3, 1939, Britain honored that promise. That date matters because it sets the tone for everything that follows. Poland was invaded. Britain and France declared war. But what came next wasn't a massive coordinated punch that stopped Hitler in his tracks. It was hesitation and delay, what people later called the phony war. Armies faced each other, but the decisive action didn't come right away. And outside a small group of countries, a lot of the world was still trying to keep distance. Here's the harsh truth about that moment. Britain wasn't just taking on Germany's military power. Britain was stepping into a war where many nations, big and small, were still asking the same cold question: do we really have to get involved? And some nations were already making choices that later on they wouldn't want to talk about too loudly. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, and the two powers carved up parts of Eastern Europe between them. That doesn't mean they were best friends forever, but it does mean Germany wasn't isolated the way you might expect. The world wasn't united against Hitler, not even close. Meanwhile, in the United States, the scars from World War I still ran deep. Many Americans wanted no part of another European war. Neutrality and stay-out-of-it politics were powerful. Roosevelt understood the danger, but he also had to navigate a country that wasn't eager to send sons across the ocean again. So Britain was in a war it didn't ask for, and it was quickly realizing it might be fighting longer than anyone wanted to admit. Then 1940 hit like a sledgehammer. In the spring of 1940, Germany unleashed fast, coordinated attacks across Western Europe. One after another, countries fell. Denmark and Norway were hit, then the Netherlands and Belgium, and then the big one, France. France wasn't just any country. France was supposed to be the anchor on the continent, a major military power, a key partner, but Germany's speed and tactics shattered the old assumptions. The war didn't look like 1914. It was aircraft, tanks, movement, chaos, whole fronts collapsing before leaders even understood what was happening. And Britain's army on the continent, the British Expeditionary Force, was suddenly in danger of being trapped and destroyed. That's where Dunkirk comes in. At Dunkirk, Britain pulled off an evacuation that became legend. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were lifted off beaches and brought home. It was a survival miracle. But it was also a warning. Because to escape that trap, the British left behind huge amounts of heavy equipment, guns, vehicles, supplies, things you need for a long war. Britain saved its soldiers, but it came home bruised and underarmed. And then France surrendered. Let that sink in. One of the strongest countries in Europe was out of the fight in weeks. So now, look at the map. Germany controlled or dominated most of Western Europe. Nazi forces had access to ports, airfields, and coastlines stretching across the continent. Suddenly, the English Channel didn't feel like a comfortable moat. It felt like a narrow strip of water separating Britain from a machine that had just steamrolled everything in its path. This is where people love to jump straight to the inspirational lines. We shall fight on the beaches. The stiff upper lip. The defiance. But before the heroic speeches, there was something else. Fear. Real fear, not movie fear, not dramatic fear. The practical fear that your country might be invaded, your skies might be owned by enemy planes, and your supply lines might get strangled until you can't breathe. Because that was the next problem. Britain's survival depended on supplies coming across the sea. Food, Oil, ammunition, raw materials, everything needed to keep the island running and keep the military fighting. And in the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted those supply routes like wolves. If those convoys stopped, Britain didn't just lose battles. Britain faced starvation, economic collapse, and military paralysis. So even without a single German soldier stepping onto British soil, the war was already pressing a knife to Britain's throat. And here's the part that stings when you look back. In that moment, after France fell, Britain was facing the full weight of Nazi Germany in Western Europe, and a lot of the world still wasn't rushing to jump in. Some nations stayed officially neutral. Some traded where they could. Some watched to see what would happen next. And Britain was trying to do the impossible: rebuild its defenses, protect the seas, prepare for air attack, and keep fighting while knowing it might be on its own for a long time. This is also where a myth sometimes forms, so let's be careful and keep it grounded. Britain was not literally alone in the sense of having zero friends anywhere on Earth. It still had its empire and Commonwealth resources. It still had people who supported it. It still had connections, trade, and help in limited forms. But in the core sense, the sense that matters in a life-or-death war, Britain was staring at Nazi Germany without a major military superpower fully committed at its side. No massive American army in Europe, no Soviet front crushing German divisions. No huge, grand alliance the way we picture it later. That version of the war, America, the USSR, Britain all aligned in one unstoppable bloc that comes later. Right now, Britain is looking at the channel and realizing something terrifying. If Germany can win the air, an invasion becomes possible. If Germany can choke the seas, Britain can't keep fighting. If Britain breaks, there may be no base left for anyone to come back and fight from. And Germany understood that too, because after France fell, Hitler's next logical move was to force Britain out, by invasion, by bombing, by blockade, or by simply terrifying the population into giving up. That's the pressure Britain was under as summer 1940 approached. And while Britain braced for what was coming, other nations still had choices. They could fully commit. They could take risks. They could prioritize principle over comfort, but many did what humans and governments often do when danger is close but not yet personal. They waited, they debated, they made deals carefully. They tried to buy time. Britain didn't have the luxury of time because the next phase of the war wasn't going to be fought with speeches. It was going to be fought in the sky above British cities, in the waters of the Atlantic, and in the daily grind of a nation trying not to get crushed. And once the Luftwaffe started coming, Britain was going to learn the difference between sympathy and real support the hard way. That's where we're headed next. By late summer 1940, Britain wasn't guessing anymore. The threat wasn't theoretical, it was overhead. Germany needed one big thing before it could seriously consider crossing the channel: control of the air. No air control, no safe invasion fleet. So the Luftwaffe came for the Royal Air Force. This is the moment people remember as the Battle of Britain. And it wasn't a clean, simple, good guys win story. It was a brutal math problem. Britain had limited pilots, limited planes, limited room for mistakes. Germany had momentum and new bases across the occupied coastline. If Britain lost its air defenses, the war could be over fast. So Britain fought like a nation with its back against the wall, because that's exactly what it was. Fighter squadrons were stretched thin. Airfields got hit again and again. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, came back shaking, refueled, and went right back up. Radar, ground crews, and command coordination mattered as much as the dogfights because Britain had to make every plane count. And all the while, the clock was ticking. Britain didn't know if help would come. Britain didn't even know if it would still exist in a month. Then the bombing expanded. The Luftwaffe didn't just target airfields and military sites. British cities began taking hits. London became a symbol, but it wasn't only London. Homes, factories, docks, streets, places where regular people lived were suddenly part of the battlefield. Night after night, bombs fell. Fires spread. Families slept in shelters and train stations. People went to work the next morning anyway because the country had to keep moving. Britain wasn't just fighting an enemy military, it was trying to keep a society functioning while it got punched in the face. And here's the key point for this story. Britain was doing this without the kind of full, committed backing that later gets baked into the Allies legend. Yes, there was sympathy. Yes, there were speeches. But sympathy doesn't stop a bomb. And speeches don't escort convoys across the Atlantic. Britain needed ships, weapons, fuel, food, real material. And those things had to cross a U-boat-infested ocean. This is where the war becomes less glamorous and more terrifying. Because Germany didn't have to invade Britain to cripple it. Germany could starve Britain. If the shipping lanes collapsed, Britain couldn't feed its people or supply its military. The Atlantic became a rolling, freezing battlefield where merchant sailors and escorts fought for every mile. Convoys weren't just lines on a map, they were lifelines. And German U-boats hunted those lifelines constantly. Picture a freighter in rough seas, blacked out at night, knowing there might be a torpedo coming out of the darkness. One hit and you're in freezing water. No dramatic hero speech, just panic, fire, and the ocean swallowing men and steel. That was the pressure Britain lived under day after day. And while Britain was trying to survive in the air and at sea, it was also fighting beyond the island. North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the wider imperial routes. Britain couldn't just pull back and defend the home islands because the war was global by nature. Oil, shipping, bases, choke points. If Britain lost control of key routes, it lost the ability to keep fighting. So Britain kept fighting on multiple fronts with limited resources, which is easy to say and hard to truly imagine. Now, while all of this was happening, what were the big powers doing? In the United States, Roosevelt leaned toward aiding Britain, but he had to navigate an American public that didn't want another European war. Isolationism wasn't some fringe idea, it was mainstream. People feared getting dragged into another bloodbath overseas. So help, when it came carefully, slowly, and often with conditions. Britain pushed hard for support, especially naval support and weapons. And the deals that emerged weren't framed as America joining Britain. They were framed as transactions. One of the most famous early ones was the Destroyers for Bases deal, Britain receiving older American destroyers in exchange for access to British bases. Whether you view that as smart strategy or cold bargaining, the reality is the same. Britain was so desperate it was trading strategic assets for ships. That's not how a confident alliance acts. That's how a country acts when it's trying not to drown. And Britain noticed the tone. British leaders understood they needed American support, but they also understood what it felt like to be in a fight for survival, while the other side measured help in terms of cost, politics, and leverage. Now here's something that complicates the neutral image even more. During this period, the United States still had significant trade relationships and economic interests in the wider world. There were arguments about embargoes, about what to sell, about how to balance business with strategy. The public debate often sounded like this: we don't want war, but we also don't want to cripple our economy. From Britain's perspective, though, it could feel like watching people count profits while your house burns. And then there was the Soviet Union. This part tends to get smoothed out in popular storytelling, but it matters if you're trying to understand why Britain felt so isolated. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression arrangement with Germany at the start of the war. That relationship included economic exchange, resources moving that helped Germany keep its war machine running. Britain was fighting Nazi Germany, and one of the other major powers in Europe was, at minimum, doing business that benefited Germany. You don't have to paint it with dramatic language to see what it meant in practice. It helped Germany sustain its ability to wage war. Britain couldn't stop it. Britain couldn't pressure the Soviets into joining the fight. Britain was already stretched to the limit, just trying to keep its own people alive and its convoys afloat. So the early war had a strange, ugly shape. Britain was fully engaged in total war. Germany was fully engaged in total war, and huge parts of the world were still maneuvering, trying to stay out, trying to profit, trying to delay the moment they'd have to choose. But Britain's refusal to collapse changed the equation, because every month Britain stayed in the war stayed alive, and the longer the war stayed alive, the harder it became for others to avoid it. That's the key. Britain didn't survive because a cavalry showed up. Britain survived long enough that the war stopped being optional for everyone else. By 1941, Britain was battered. Bomb damage scarred cities. Shipping losses hurt. The economy was strained. The military was fighting on multiple fronts. But Britain was still standing. And that fact forced a shift in global thinking. If Britain had collapsed in 1940, the war could have ended fast in the West. Germany would have dominated Europe without a major enemy in the West. Other nations could have kept bargaining, trading, and maneuvering. But because Britain didn't collapse, the war became a long grind. And long wars eventually grab everyone. Then came the shock that detonated the whole global situation. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the comfortable arrangement between Berlin and Moscow was gone. The Soviet Union, after a period of not fighting Germany, was now fighting for its life, and instantly the story started shifting. Now the Soviet Union was positioned as a frontline opponent of Nazi Germany, and to be clear, once the fighting began, the Eastern Front became enormous and unbelievably deadly. The scale and casualties were massive. The Soviet contribution after June 1941 was real and central to the defeat of Germany, but for Britain there was a bitter edge to the timing. Britain had been fighting since 1939, isolated after 1940, absorbing air attacks, protecting the Atlantic, fighting abroad, holding on by its fingernails. The Soviet Union joined the fight when it was invaded, not because it chose to uphold Poland, not because it decided fascism must be confronted early. It fought because it had no alternative. Britain welcomed the Soviet Union as an ally because Britain needed allies. Britain needed any pressure taken off, any resources, any strategic shift that could help. But the emotional reality didn't vanish. Britain could do the math. Britain knew who had been in from the start and who had arrived when the fire reached their own doorstep. And that's where the tension in the story builds. Because now, with the Soviet Union in the fight, the future narrative was already starting to form in real time. Who gets framed as the main hero? Who gets center stage? Who becomes the decisive force? Britain was still fighting everywhere it could, still escorting convoys, still bleeding, still rebuilding, still refusing to break. But the war was turning into something else, a war of giants. And Britain could feel what that might mean later, when the smoke cleared and the history books got written. Because once the biggest powers fully enter a story, they tend to tell it like they were the main characters all along. And Britain, exhausted but still standing, was about to watch that happen again. This time with the United States, because the next major shift wouldn't come from Britain begging harder. It would come from an attack that made staying out impossible. And when that moment hit, the 731 days Britain spent absorbing the worst alone would start getting blurred into a nicer, cleaner story. In December 1941, the world flipped. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States went to war in the Pacific, and then Germany declared war on the United States right after, pulling America fully into the European War too. From that moment on, the story most people know takes over. Allies versus Axis. Big speeches, big factories, big armies, the combined power of America, the Soviet Union, and Britain. And let's be clear, once the United States entered, it mattered a lot. American industry ramped up in a way Britain simply couldn't match. Ships, aircraft, vehicles, weapons, production at enormous scale. That flood of material changed the entire strategic picture over time. It strengthened Britain, supplied allies, and helped build the capacity for major offensives. At the same time, the Soviet Union was now locked in a gigantic struggle on the Eastern Front. The fighting there was brutal beyond description, and the casualties were staggering. The Soviet role in grinding down German land forces became a central pillar of Germany's defeat. So yes, after 1941, the war becomes a combined effort in a way it wasn't before. But here's the point this whole story has been building toward. America and the Soviet Union didn't enter the war because Britain's cities burned. They entered because they were forced into it by direct attack and direct invasion. That doesn't make their sacrifices less real. It does matter for the timeline, because by the time the team existed, Britain had already survived the period when defeat looked most likely. Britain had already endured the air attacks, the supply crisis, the fear of invasion, and the grinding reality of fighting, while not knowing if anyone would ever show up in a real way. And once America entered, something subtle happened. Almost instantly, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, the war was remembered as a united front, a grand alliance from the start. Everyone standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny, like it was obvious and inevitable. But it wasn't inevitable. It was messy. It was delayed. And for a long early stretch, Britain carried the fight in the West, while others stayed out, or stayed ambiguous. Now look at what happens next. With America and the USSR in the war, the conflict expands into huge multi-year operations. North Africa intensifies. Italy becomes a major campaign. The Battle of the Atlantic continues. Strategic bombing grows. And planning begins for the invasion of Western Europe. Britain is in all of it. British forces fight across multiple theaters. British naval power remains crucial in protecting sea lanes. British intelligence work and planning become major pieces of the wider strategy. Britain provides bases, staging areas, and experience, because Britain's been fighting this war longer than the new arrivals. But popular memory has a funny way of working. Whoever has the biggest microphone later tends to define the story. In the United States, newsreels and later movies naturally focus on American soldiers, American units, American victories. That's not some evil plot. Countries tell stories about themselves. But the effect is real. The war becomes framed in American cultural terms. Then, after the war, American film and television pour gasoline on that memory. Decades of entertainment reinforce a familiar picture: American landing craft, American paratroopers, American heroism. British roles appear, but often as supporting characters, and the public memory takes shape accordingly. Even when an operation is clearly combined, the spotlight often leans American. Take Normandy, D-Day. D-Day was not a solo mission. It was a combined operation with British, American, Canadian, and other allied forces, backed by years of planning, intelligence, deception efforts, naval power, and logistics. But the popular story many people absorb, especially in the U.S., often feels like the war really started getting won the moment American boots hit that beach, which quietly pushes the earlier years, when Britain was hanging on, into the background. On the Soviet side, something similar happens, but in a different style. Soviet wartime propaganda and later Soviet-era storytelling emphasized the Eastern Front as the central, decisive theater, and in terms of scale and casualties, the Eastern Front was enormous. It's true that huge portions of Germany's land forces were engaged there, and that Soviet losses were massive. But the way the story is sometimes framed, especially in Soviet-era narratives, can minimize everyone else, as if the war was basically the USSR alone versus Germany. In that version, Britain's early stand doesn't get much attention. The years when Britain kept fighting while Germany dominated Western Europe become, at best, a sidebar. And here's the twist. After WW ends, the Cold War starts hard and fast. The wartime alliance fractures. The U.S. and USSR become rivals. Each side builds a national myth around the war that fits its new identity. America emphasizes itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, the industrial powerhouse that saved the world. The Soviet Union emphasizes itself as the heroic, sacrificial force that crushed fascism through sheer blood and endurance. And where does that leave Britain? Squeezed between two superpowers with competing stories. Britain had fought from the start. Britain had endured the early years with limited help. Britain had stayed in the war when defeat looked plausible. But Britain did not have the same post-war cultural and political dominance as the United States. And Britain did not have the same propaganda machine as the Soviet Union. So Britain's experience, the part that doesn't fit neatly into either superpower's preferred story, gets pushed to the margins. And then there's the money side of it. When the war ended, Britain wasn't celebrating from a position of strength. Britain was exhausted and financially strained after years of total war. Cities needed rebuilding. The economy was battered. The empire was under pressure. The cost of holding the line early and fighting everywhere later was enormous. Meanwhile, the United States came out of the war economically powerful. It had the industrial capacity, the lending capacity, the influence. So the post-war world forms with America holding many of the cards. Britain does receive support and financing in different forms, but it also ends up tied into obligations, debts, loans, terms. Again, that's not shocking in international politics, but it adds another layer to the emotional truth of the story. Britain spends years fighting while others hold back. Then Britain wins with them because it can't win without them. And afterward, Britain finds itself financially weaker than the latecomers who now dominate the narrative. That is exactly how a country can get erased from the popular version of its own war. Not erased from the record, but reduced in the way the public remembers. Now let's zoom out and ask the bigger question. Why does this matter? Because the core lesson isn't Britain good, everyone else bad. That's too simple, and history almost never works that cleanly. The real point is about timing, choice, and the difference between principle and self-interest. Britain made a commitment tied to Poland and chose to fight. Once France fell, Britain didn't get to decide whether the war would be convenient. It was in it, fully, and it kept going when the rational, self-preserving option could have been negotiation. The Soviet Union fought with gigantic sacrifice after 1941, but only after it was invaded. The United States fought with massive industrial power and military force after 1941, but only after it was attacked. Those contributions were decisive. They mattered. They deserve recognition. But they are not the same kind of decision as choosing to enter early and then choosing again, every day, not to quit while the world hesitates. Because think about what those early days really were. Every single day, Britain could have thrown in the towel. Every day, leaders could have tried to cut a deal. Every day, the public could have demanded an end. Every day, the pressure could have cracked the nation. And yet, Britain kept going. Not because rescue was guaranteed, not because victory was guaranteed, but because surrender felt worse than the risk. And that early refusal is one of the reasons anything that came later was even possible. Because without Britain still in the war, what would the map have looked like by the time Germany invaded the USSR? By the time Pearl Harbor happened, where would there have been a strong base in the West? Ports, airfields, staging grounds for the later campaigns. Britain staying in the war kept the conflict alive in the West. It forced Germany to keep resources tied up. It prevented a quick, clean Nazi consolidation of Europe that might have changed every later decision. And yet, despite that, the simplified story many people absorb is America saved the day. The Soviet Union did the real fighting. Britain was there, I guess. That's not accurate. It's incomplete. So here's what I want you to remember when someone says, the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, like it was a neat group project from the first page. For a long early stretch, there weren't allies the way we think of them later. There was Britain, taking hits, fighting at sea, fighting in the air, stretched across multiple fronts, while others stayed out, stayed hesitant, or stayed tied up in their own deals and calculations. And when the giants did enter, they became the loudest voices afterward. That's why Britain's early burden gets blurred. That's why those days matter, because this isn't only a WD story. It's a human pattern. People and nations often rush to claim the credit after the danger has passed. They love the victory photo. They love the clean ending. But they don't always want to talk about who stood there first. When it was still risky, when it was still unpopular, when it looked like a losing bet. Britain's early stand wasn't the whole war. It wasn't the only sacrifice. It wasn't the only decisive contribution. But it was the foundation that helped make the rest possible. So don't let the timeline get rewritten into something easier and cleaner than it was. Acknowledge the American industrial power that helped win it. Acknowledge the Soviet bloodshed that crushed Germany's armies. And also acknowledge that Britain, before any of that, kept the fight alive when the outcome was far from certain. If this story gave you a different angle on a war you thought you already knew, tap the like button because it tells the algorithm you want more history that doesn't skip the hard parts.